Commander Hal stood on the bridge of his observation vessel and looked down at the small blue planet below. He had conquered 17 worlds in his 300 years of service to the Empire. He had broken the will of species far larger and far more advanced than these primitive creatures called humans. This mission was supposed to be simple. Watch them, study them, report back to the High Council. Then the invasion fleet would arrive and add another world to the Empire's collection. His ship hung silently in orbit, wrapped in a cloaking field that made it invisible to the crude detection systems the humans used. Hal had read the initial reports about this species. They had only recently discovered how to leave their own atmosphere. They still fought wars against each other using chemical propellants and explosive projectiles. By standards, they were barely more advanced than animals. "Begin surface scans," he ordered his second officer, a young female named "Find me population centers, military installations, and communication hubs. I want a full assessment within 10 cycles." Worked her console with practice speed. Data began flowing across the main display screen. Cities appeared as bright clusters of light on the dark side of the planet. The humans had spread themselves across nearly every landmass. Their population numbered in the billions. "Commander," said, her voice carrying a note of confusion, "I am detecting active weapons fire in this region." She highlighted a section of the planet's surface. It was a dry, sandy area with scattered structures and rough terrain. Hal leaned forward with interest. "They are fighting each other." "Yes, Commander. 2 separate human factions appear to be engaged in direct combat." This was perfect. Hal could observe their military capabilities firsthand without revealing his presence. He would see how they fought, how they organized themselves, and most importantly, how quickly they broke under pressure. "Deploy micro-drones to that location," he commanded. "I want visual and audio feeds. Let us see what these humans are made of." The drones were small enough to fit in the palm of his hand, equipped with sensors that could pick up a whispered conversation from 100 meters away. They descended through the atmosphere and spread out across the battlefield, sending back crystal-clear images to the observation vessel. What Hal saw confused him at first. A small group of human soldiers had taken position in a cluster of damaged buildings. They were surrounded on 3 sides by a much larger enemy force. Their vehicles were destroyed. Their communication equipment appeared to be damaged. By any reasonable military assessment, they were finished. The smart thing to do would be to surrender. Any species with basic survival instincts would recognize a hopeless situation and submit to the stronger force. This was how the universe worked. They had built their empire on this simple truth. But the humans did not surrender. Hal watched as a human male moved from position to position, checking on each soldier and speaking to them in a calm, steady voice. The drone's translator identified him as Sergeant Danny. He was not a large human, but the others clearly looked to him for guidance. "Listen up," said to his soldiers. "We've got hostiles on 3 sides and no backup coming for at least 6 hours. Our job is to hold this position until they get here. That's it. That's all we have to do." One of the younger soldiers spoke up. His face was covered in dust and there was fear in his eyes. "Sarge, there's got to be 50 of them out there, maybe more. We've only got 12 people." Nodded, then they should have brought more. The other soldiers laughed. They actually laughed. Hal could not understand this response. These humans were facing almost certain death and they were making jokes. The attack came 20 minutes later. The enemy force advanced from multiple directions, laying down heavy fire. Hal expected the human defensive position to collapse within moments. It did not. The humans fought with a coordination and intensity that surprised him. They called out enemy positions to each other, covered each other's movements, and maintained a disciplined rate of fire that kept the attackers at bay. When one soldier ran low on ammunition, another would slide a fresh supply across the ground without being asked. A young female soldier named was hit in the shoulder by enemy fire. Hal watched her fall behind a concrete barrier, clutching the wound. Blood seeped between her fingers. His medical officer, observing the same feed, noted that such an injury would cause extreme pain in humans. Did not scream. She did not cry. She took a piece of cloth from her pocket, put one end in her teeth, and wrapped it tightly around her shoulder with her one working hand. Then she picked up her weapon and resumed firing. "Commander," the medical officer said quietly, "that should not be possible. The pain alone should have rendered her unconscious." Hal said nothing, he simply watched. The battle continued for hours. The sun moved across the sky and began to set. The humans ran low on water and shared what little they had left. They ran low on medical supplies and used torn clothing to bandage wounds. They ran low on ammunition and made every shot count. When night fell, the attacks paused. The enemy forces pulled back to regroup and wait for morning. Inside the human defensive position, Sergeant moved among his soldiers once again. "Good work today," he told them. "Get some rest if you can. Drink water, check your gear. We do this all over again tomorrow." A soldier named Ben Torres, a large man with blood on his face from a cut above his eye, looked up at. "You think they'll come back in the morning, Sarge?" "I'm counting on it," replied. "Every hour they spend trying to dig us out is an hour they're not spending somewhere else. We're doing exactly what we're supposed to do." Hal turned away from the display screen. His hands were shaking slightly, though he did not know why. He had witnessed countless battles across his long career. He had seen species fight and die on dozens of worlds, but he had never seen anything like this. These humans were outnumbered, injured, and exhausted. They had every reason to give up, and yet they kept fighting, not because they thought they would win, but because giving up was simply not something they considered. "Commander," I asked, "what are your orders?" Hal took a long moment before answering. "Continue observation. I want to see how this ends." He returned to his quarters that night, but he did not sleep. He kept thinking about the look in Sergeant's eyes when he told his soldiers they would do it all over again tomorrow. There was no fear there, no desperation, just a quiet, unbreakable determination that Hal had never encountered before. For the first time in 300 years, Commander Hal felt something he did not recognize. It took him several hours to identify the emotion. It was doubt. The sun rose over the desert and the fighting began again. Hal had not left his observation post all night. He stood before the display screens with his 4 arms folded behind his back, watching every movement, listening to every word. His crew had rotated through their rest periods, but he refused to leave. Something was happening on that battlefield that he needed to understand. The enemy forces attacked with the first light of dawn. They had brought reinforcements during the night. Hal counted at least 70 fighters moving toward the human position. The 12 defenders had become 9 during the night. 3 had died from their wounds despite the efforts of the unit's medic. 9 against 70. The outcome was obvious to any rational observer. The humans did not seem to care about obvious outcomes. Sergeant positioned his remaining soldiers with careful precision. Each one had clear firing lines. Each one knew exactly what they were supposed to do. They had transformed the ruined buildings into a fortress of broken concrete and twisted metal. "Here they come," announced calmly. "Make them pay for every inch." The attack was brutal. Bullets filled the air like angry insects. Explosions sent clouds of dust and debris across the battlefield. The noise was overwhelming, even through the drone's audio sensors. Hal watched a human soldier named Tony take a bullet to the leg. The man fell behind cover, his face twisted in pain. Another soldier, a woman named Maria Santos, immediately crawled to his position while enemy fire struck the ground around her. "I'm fine," said through gritted teeth. "Get back to your post." Santos ignored him completely. She pulled a medical kit from her vest and began working on his wound. Bullets snapped past her head, close enough that she must have felt the wind of their passing. She did not flinch. She did not hurry. She worked with steady hands until the bleeding was under control. "You're stupid," told her. "You could have been killed." "Then stop getting shot," Santos replied and returned to her position. Hal's medical officer stood beside him, monitoring the biological data from the drones. "Commander, I am detecting something unusual. Several of these humans are functioning despite injuries that should have incapacitated them. Their bodies are producing massive quantities of certain chemicals, adrenaline, cortisol, endorphins. They seem to be suppressing their own pain responses through sheer biological willpower." "Is that possible?" Hal asked. "It should not be, and yet I am observing it directly." The battle raged on. By midday, the humans had repelled 3 separate attacks. They had also lost 2 more soldiers. Only 7 remained. The ground around their position was covered with fallen enemies. Hal counted at least 30 bodies. The humans had killed more than 4 times their own number, and they showed no signs of giving up. During a brief pause in the fighting, Hal observed something that he could not explain. Ben Torres, the large soldier with the cut above his eye, noticed that one of his fellow soldiers had stopped moving. The man, whose name was Chris Palmer, had taken a bullet to the chest during the last attack. He was still breathing, but barely. He could not walk. He could not fight. Torres moved to Palmer's position without hesitation. Enemy snipers were still active. Every moment in the open was a risk. Torres did not seem to care. "Hold on, brother," Torres said as he lifted Palmer onto his back. "I've got you." Palmer was not a small man. He must have weighed at least 80 kilograms. Torres carried him anyway, moving from cover to cover, while somehow still firing his weapon with one hand. Hal had seen many things in his long life. He had seen acts of courage and acts of cowardice. He had seen soldiers die for their causes and soldiers abandon their posts, but he had never seen anything like this. Torres was risking his own life to save a man who might already be dying. There was no tactical advantage to this action. It actually weakened the defensive position. "Why is he doing that?" Hal asked, not really expecting an answer. I checked the drone's audio records. Earlier in the battle, the injured soldier asked the same question. The large one replied that Palmer was his brother. "They are biological siblings." "No, Commander. Our records indicate they are not related. They did not even know each other before this military assignment." Hal fell silent. The concept did not translate into anything he understood. Torres reached the medic's position and set Palmer down gently. The medic, a tired-looking man named Sam, immediately went to work. Had been awake for over 30 hours. His hands were covered in dried blood. His eyes were hollow with exhaustion, but his hands did not shake and his focus did not waver. "You're going to be okay," told Palmer. "I've got you, just stay with me." It was a lie. Hal could see that knew it was a lie. The wound was too severe. Palmer would not survive without advanced medical care that was not available, but kept working anyway, kept talking to the dying man, kept trying. The next attack came just before sunset. This time the enemy brought explosives. They breached the outer wall of the human position and poured through the gap. The fighting became close and desperate. Hal watched Sergeant fight hand-to-hand with an enemy soldier, was smaller than his opponent. He was also injured, with blood soaking through his uniform from a wound in his side, but he fought with a ferocity that seemed almost inhuman. He used his rifle as a club when his ammunition ran out. When the rifle broke, he used his knife. When his knife was knocked away, he used his fists. He won. As the sun set on the second day, the enemy forces finally pulled back. They had taken too many losses. They could not break through the human position. 7 defenders remained, though most of them were wounded. Gathered his soldiers one more time. "Relief is coming," he told them. 2 hours out, we just have to hold for 2 more hours. "We can do that, Sarge," Maria Santos said. There was no doubt in her voice. After everything they had been through, after all the blood and pain and death, she still believed they would survive. They all believed it. Hal stepped back from the display screen. He felt something cold spreading through his chest. It was not admiration. It was not respect. It was fear. "Commander," I asked carefully, "are you unwell?" "I am beginning to understand something," Hal replied slowly. "These creatures do not fight like any species we have ever conquered. They do not calculate odds. They do not weigh costs and benefits. They simply refuse to accept defeat." "Is that not a weakness?" I asked. "An inability to recognize when a battle is lost?" Hal shook his head. "I thought so at first. Now I am not certain. When a species fights without the possibility of surrender, you cannot break their will. You can only kill them, all of them, every single one." He turned to look at the planet below, with its billions of humans going about their lives. And there are so very many of them. 2 hours later, human reinforcements arrived. The enemy forces scattered and fled. The 7 survivors of the original 12 were evacuated to safety. Against all logic, against all reason, they had won. Hal watched them being loaded onto transport vehicles. They were broken and bleeding and exhausted. Several would carry scars for the rest of their lives, but they were alive. And when asked by arriving officers what had happened, Sergeant simply shrugged and said, "We held the position." As if it had been nothing, as if it had been easy. Hal realized in that moment that he needed to learn much more about these humans before he could make his report to the High Council. What he had witnessed over the past 2 days had changed something inside him. He did not yet know what that change meant, but he knew that his original assessment of this species had been dangerously wrong. He gave orders to maintain observation and began compiling his notes. There was so much more to learn. 3 days had passed since the battle ended. Hal had not returned to the surface feeds. Instead, he had ordered his intelligence team to compile a complete history of human warfare. He wanted to understand what he had witnessed. He wanted to know if those soldiers were unusual or if they represented something more fundamental about their species. The report arrived on his console in the middle of the night cycle. It was massive. Thousands of pages of data. Hundreds of hours of visual records. His intelligence officer, a meticulous male named OK, stood at attention while Hal began to read. "Sir," OK said nervously, "I should warn you that the contents of this report are disturbing." Hal almost laughed. He had conquered 17 worlds. He had witnessed the death of civilizations. What could possibly disturb him? He began to read. 2 hours later he stopped. His hands were trembling. His stomach churned with nausea. He had only made it through a fraction of the document. The humans had been fighting wars since before they developed written language. Their earliest records spoke of battles and conquests. Their religions featured warrior gods. Their oldest stories glorified combat and honored those who died fighting. This was not unusual. Many species passed through violent phases in their development. They themselves had once been warriors before they discovered the efficiency of organized conquest, but most species eventually grew past their primitive aggression. They learned that cooperation was more valuable than conflict. The humans had not learned this lesson. Hal scrolled through a list of their major wars. There were so many that his translator struggled to keep up. Wars over land, wars over resources, wars over ideas, wars over gods, wars that lasted decades, wars that consumed entire generations. He found a conflict they called the First World War. It had killed nearly 20 million humans. He assumed this must have been a turning point. Surely such a devastating experience would have taught them to avoid future conflicts. He was wrong. Less than 30 years later, they fought an even larger war. The Second World War killed between 70 and 80 million humans. Entire cities were burned to ash. Entire populations were systematically murdered. Weapons were developed that could level mountains and poison the land for generations. And then, at the end of this war, the humans did something that made Hal's blood run cold. They built a weapon that could destroy entire cities in a single blast. They called it an atomic bomb, and they used it, twice, against civilian populations. Hal read the reports from the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He saw the images of the destruction. He read accounts from survivors who described flesh melting from bones, shadows burned permanently into stone, radiation sickness that killed slowly over weeks and months. "Okay," Hal said quietly. After witnessing this destruction, the humans banned these weapons, yes. They recognized the danger and eliminated them. OK shifted uncomfortably. "No, Commander. After the war ended, multiple human nations began developing their own atomic weapons. They eventually created even more powerful devices, hydrogen bombs, thermonuclear warheads. By our latest count, they possess enough of these weapons to destroy their entire planet several times over. And they still have them. They have more than ever." Hal closed his eyes. He tried to imagine a species so committed to warfare that they would build weapons capable of ending their own existence. He could not make it fit into any framework he understood. He continued reading. The report documented countless smaller conflicts that occurred between the major wars. Humans seemed incapable of going more than a few years without fighting somewhere on their planet. They fought in jungles and deserts and frozen wastelands. They fought on mountains and in cities and across open plains. They developed new weapons constantly, finding more and more efficient ways to kill each other. But it was not the scale of their wars that disturbed Hal most. It was the details. He read about individual soldiers who accomplished things that should have been impossible. A pilot named Hart who flew combat missions for 3 days with a broken arm because her unit needed air support. A soldier who continued fighting after losing both legs. Medics who worked under enemy fire for hours without rest. Prisoners of war who refused to give up information despite years of torture. He found records of something called the Siege of Leningrad, where a human city was surrounded by enemy forces for nearly 900 days. The people inside starved. They froze. They ate rats and leather and glue to survive. Nearly 1 million of them died. They did not surrender. Hal found records of a last stand at a place called Thermopylae, where 300 warriors held a narrow pass against an army of hundreds of thousands. They knew they would die. They fought anyway. Their story was still told thousands of years later. He found records of a battle at a place called Stalingrad, where humans fought building by building, room by room, for months. The death toll reached into the millions. Both sides refused to give up. The city was reduced to rubble and still they kept fighting. The pattern was always the same. No matter how hopeless the situation, no matter how certain the defeat, humans kept fighting. They would rather die than surrender. And somehow, often enough to matter, they won battles they had no business winning. Hal set down his data tablet and stared at the wall of his quarters. His mind was struggling to process what he had learned. The method of conquest was simple and efficient. They arrived with overwhelming force. They demonstrated their power. They broke the will of the target species through a combination of fear and inevitability. Within a few cycles, resistance crumbled. The conquered species accepted their new place in the empire. This method had worked 17 times without fail. Hal now understood that it would not work on humans. You could not break the will of a species that considered surrender worse than death. You could not frighten creatures who built weapons capable of destroying their own world and kept them pointed at each other for decades. You could not intimidate a people whose entire history was written in blood and fire. If they invaded Earth, the humans would fight. They would fight with everything they had. And even if the Empire won, even if they killed millions or billions of humans, the survivors would keep fighting. They would never stop. They would resist until the last human drew the last breath. And there were 8 billion of them. Hal thought about the soldiers he had watched in the desert, Sergeant and his small unit. They had faced impossible odds and refused to give up. At the time, he had thought they were exceptional. Now he understood that they were typical. That calm determination, that willingness to die rather than submit, ran through the entire species like a thread of iron. He thought about what would happen if humans ever developed faster than light travel. If they ever left their small planet and discovered that they were not alone in the universe. If they ever turned that endless capacity for violence outward instead of inward. The thought made him feel sick. He pulled up a star map on his display screen. The Empire stretched across 47 inhabited systems. It had taken thousands of years to build. It was the most powerful force in known space. And Hal was suddenly not certain that it could survive first contact with humanity. He stayed awake all night, reading more of the report, learning more about these impossible creatures, and with every page his certainty grew. He could not recommend invasion. He would not recommend invasion. The question now was how to make the High Council understand what he had learned, how to make them see what he saw, how to convince them that, for the first time in their long history of conquest, they had found a species that could not be conquered. By morning, he had made his decision. He knew what he had to do. It would cost him everything he had built over 300 years. But some things were more important than career and reputation. Some things were more important than personal survival. He began composing his request for an audience with the High Council. The quantum relay chamber hummed with energy as the connection was established. Hal stood alone in the center of the room, wearing his full ceremonial uniform. The 12 seats of the High Council materialized before him as holographic projections, each occupied by one of the most powerful beings in the Empire. High Counselor sat at the center, her ancient eyes studying Hal with obvious confusion. "Commander, your request for this audience was most unusual. Your mission was a simple reconnaissance operation. It did not require our direct involvement." "I understand, High Counselor," Hal replied, keeping his voice steady. "However, what I have discovered requires the Council's immediate attention. I believe I have found something that threatens the future of our empire." The counselors exchanged glances. Hal was one of their most decorated commanders. He had never been prone to exaggeration or unnecessary alarm. "Very well," said, "present your findings." Hal transferred his complete report to the Council's systems. He watched as the 12 most powerful beings in the Empire began to review the information he had spent days compiling. The battle footage, the historical archives, the psychological assessments, the casualty figures from thousands of years of human warfare. The chamber was silent for a long time. Counselor, who oversaw military operations, spoke first. "This is impressive documentation, Commander. But I fail to see the threat. These humans are still confined to their single planet. Their technology is primitive compared to ours. Their weapons could not even scratch the hull of a standard warship." "With respect, Counselor, you are missing the point," Hal replied. "The threat is not their current technology. The threat is their nature. Look at the data. This species has been at war with itself for its entire existence. They have killed hundreds of millions of their own kind. They have built weapons capable of destroying their own world, and still they persist. Still they grow stronger. Still they advance." High Counselor raised a hand. "I have reviewed your battle footage, Commander. These soldiers you observed. They fought well, but they were a small unit in a minor conflict. Surely they do not represent their entire species." Hal had prepared for this objection. "I thought the same thing at first, High Counselor, so I ordered a comprehensive historical analysis. What I found was consistent across thousands of years and thousands of conflicts. Humans do not surrender. They do not break. When faced with impossible odds, they fight harder." He pulled up specific examples on the display. During a siege in their ancient history, a city called Masada was surrounded by an overwhelming enemy force. The defenders knew they would lose. Rather than surrender, every single one of them chose death. Parents killed their own children rather than allow them to be taken as slaves. The counselors shifted uncomfortably. In a more recent conflict, a small unit was captured by enemy forces. They were tortured for years. They were starved and beaten and isolated. They never broke. When they were finally freed, they returned to combat duty. Hal let that sink in before continuing. High Counselor, we have conquered 17 species. We broke their will through demonstrations of overwhelming force. We made surrender seem like the only rational choice. But these humans, they do not respond to rational calculations. Surrender is not a choice they consider. Counselor was silent for a long moment. Then she spoke. What do you recommend, Commander? This was the moment Hal had been dreading. He took a deep breath. I recommend that we do not invade Earth. I recommend that we withdraw from this sector of space entirely. And I recommend that we begin preparations for the possibility that humans will eventually develop faster-than-light travel and discover us. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Counselor, the eldest member of the council, slammed his fist on the arm of his chair. Unacceptable. The Empire does not run from primitive species. We do not cower in fear of creatures who cannot even leave their own solar system. We will not be running, Counselor, Hal said calmly. We will be avoiding a war that we cannot win. Counselor laughed harshly. Cannot win? Against a species with no fleet, no interstellar capabilities. Commander, I question your judgment. Perhaps this mission has affected you in ways you do not realize. Hal had expected this response. He was prepared for it, but the accusation still stung. Let me show you something, he said, pulling up new footage on the display. This is from one of their ancient conflicts. A single human male ran toward an explosive device to protect his fellow soldiers. He knew it would kill him. He did it anyway. He switched to another clip. This is a human medic working on wounded soldiers while under active enemy fire. He was awake for 40 hours. He never stopped. Another clip. This is a pilot who flew combat missions with a broken arm for 3 days because her unit needed support. He turned to face the council directly. These are not exceptional cases. These are typical examples of human behavior under stress. They will sacrifice themselves for each other without hesitation. They will endure pain and injury that should incapacitate them. They will fight and die for concepts we cannot even translate properly. Honor, brotherhood, freedom. The chamber was silent. Now imagine, Hal continued, what would happen if we invaded their world? We would be the external threat that united them. Every faction, every nation, every competing interest would set aside their differences and turn their full attention on us. 8 billion humans with their entire industrial capacity, with their endless creativity, with their absolute refusal to surrender, all focused on one goal, destroying us. He paused to let the image form in their minds. Even if we won the initial invasion, even if we killed billions of them, the survivors would resist. They would sabotage. They would assassinate. They would fight in the shadows and in the streets and in the mountains. They would never stop. And eventually they would learn from us. They would study our technology. They would adapt our weapons. They would improve upon them. Hal's voice grew quiet. These creatures created weapons of mass destruction and then spent decades pointing them at each other. They fight among themselves with a savagery we cannot match. Imagine what they would do to an enemy who attacked their home. High Counselor studied him for a long moment. You truly believe they could threaten the Empire? I believe that if we give them a reason to come for us, they will not stop until one of our species no longer exists. And based on everything I have observed, I am not confident that we would be the survivors. The chamber fell silent again. Hal could see the counselors processing his words, weighing them against their pride and their traditions. He knew what he had to do next. He had known since he began composing this presentation. Some arguments could not be won with words alone. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up and removed his command insignia, the medal he had worn for 300 years, the symbol of everything he had achieved in his long career. He set it on the floor before the council. "I am resigning my commission," he said. "I will not lead our forces against these beings. To do so would be to doom our empire." The councilors stared at him in shock. No one had ever resigned before the High Council. It was unprecedented. "What do you intend to do?" asked. Hal straightened his spine and met her gaze directly. "I am returning to Earth, not as a conqueror but as an observer. Perhaps, if we are very wise and very careful, we can establish contact with these humans as equals before they develop the capability to find us on their own." Counselor sputtered with anger. "This is treason. You would betray your own people." "No," Hal replied quietly. "I would save them. The question is whether you will let me." He bowed once to the council and walked out of the chamber without waiting for a response. The doors closed behind him with a sound of finality. He had given up everything, his rank, his career, his place in society, but as he walked toward his shuttle, he felt something he had not felt in centuries. Hope. Perhaps it was not too late. Perhaps the two species could find another path. Perhaps humanity's greatest strength, their ability to fight and endure and never surrender, could be channeled toward something other than destruction. It was a thin hope, a fragile one, but it was better than the alternative. Hal set his course for Earth. 6 months had passed since Hal left the High Council chamber. 6 months of preparation and planning and doubt. He had spent the time learning everything he could about human customs, human language, and human psychology. He had studied their art and their music and their literature. He had watched their news broadcasts and their entertainment programs and their political debates. The more he learned, the more complex they became. They were capable of terrible cruelty and incredible kindness. They built weapons of mass destruction and hospitals that treated the sick without payment. They fought wars over trivial disputes and then sent aid to their former enemies. They were walking contradictions, impossible to predict, impossible to categorize. And yet, beneath all their complexity, he found something consistent, something that ran through every culture and every nation and every individual he studied. A fierce, stubborn, unbreakable will to survive, to grow, to become more than they were. It was terrifying. It was also in its own way beautiful. Now, as his shuttle descended through Earth's atmosphere, Hal felt the weight of what he was about to do. He had disabled all weapons. He had lowered all shields. He was broadcasting a message of peaceful intent on every frequency the humans used. He was completely vulnerable. If they chose to attack, he would die. There was nothing he could do to prevent it. He accepted this possibility. Some things were worth the risk. His shuttle touched down in a flat, open area in the central region of a continent called North America. Humans called this place Kansas. It was quiet and rural, far from their major population centers. He had chosen it specifically because he did not want to cause panic. He did not have long to wait. Within minutes, he heard the sound of approaching vehicles, then the thunder of aircraft overhead, then the whine of weapons being charged and aimed in his direction. His sensors showed him what his eyes would soon confirm. He was surrounded. Military vehicles formed a ring around his shuttle. Soldiers took up positions behind them, weapons raised. Helicopters circled above, their guns pointed at his position. It was an impressive display of force, assembled with remarkable speed. Hal took a moment to compose himself. Then he opened the shuttle door and stepped out into the Kansas sunlight. The humans reacted immediately. He heard shouted commands, saw weapons swing toward him, felt the tension in the air spike to dangerous levels. He stood very still, his 4 arms raised in what he hoped was a universal gesture of non-aggression. For a long moment, nothing happened. The humans stared at him. He stared back at them. The wind blew across the flat Kansas plains, carrying the smell of grass and earth and something chemical that might have been vehicle fuel. Then a human female began walking toward him. She moved with confidence and control, showing no sign of fear despite the impossible situation. Her uniform identified her as a military officer. Her rank insignia, which Hal had memorized during his studies, indicated she was a major. A small metal tag on her chest read. She stopped a few meters away from him and looked him up and down with calm, appraising eyes. "You picked one hell of a way to introduce yourself," she said. Hal's translator processed the idiom. His response came through a small speaker unit attached to his chest, rendered in flawless English. "I apologize for the alarm. I come alone. I have no weapons. I wish only to speak." Major Lisa studied him for a long moment. Her hand rested near her sidearm, but she had not drawn it. Behind her, dozens of soldiers waited tensely for her signal. "Speak about what?" she asked. Hal lowered his arms slowly, keeping his movements smooth and non-threatening. "I have spent 6 of your months studying your species. I came here to conquer your world. My people have conquered many worlds. We believed Earth would be easy." He paused, letting the translator catch up. "Then I watched your soldiers fight. I watched them die for each other. I watched them refuse to surrender when all logic demanded it. I watched them endure pain and injury that should have destroyed them, and I realized that my people had made a terrible mistake." Lisa's expression did not change, but something shifted in her eyes. "What kind of mistake?" "We thought you were prey," Hal said quietly. "We thought we could break your will and make you submit. We did not understand what you are." "And what are we?" The question hung in the air between them. Around them, soldiers waited. Helicopters circled. Weapons remained trained on the alien who had just landed in their midst. Hal thought about everything he had learned. The wars, the weapons, the endless capacity for violence and destruction, but also the medics working under fire. The soldiers carrying wounded comrades on their backs, the way they joked and laughed in the face of death, the bond they called brotherhood, which bound them together more tightly than any biological family. "You are warriors," he said finally, "not like any I have encountered before. Your history is written in blood. Your stories glorify combat. Your children play games of war. You have spent your entire existence fighting each other with an intensity that we cannot match." He took a step forward. The soldiers tensed, but Lisa held up her hand and they held their fire. "My people conquer through fear," Hal continued. "We show overwhelming force and we break the will of our enemies, but you cannot be broken. I watched a small group of your soldiers fight against impossible odds for 2 days. They should have surrendered. They should have given up. Instead, they held their position until reinforcements arrived, and when it was over, their leader simply said they had done their job." His voice grew quiet. "I am here because I needed to understand, and because I believe my people have made a terrible miscalculation. You are not prey. You are something else entirely, something we have never encountered before." Lisa was silent for a long moment. The wind continued to blow. The helicopters continued to circle, but something had changed. The terrible tension in the air had begun to ease just slightly. "Yeah," Lisa said finally, lowering her hand from her sidearm. "We get that a lot." Behind her, some of the soldiers exchanged glances. One of them actually smiled, just for a moment. Hal felt something loosen in his chest. He had expected many possible outcomes from this meeting. Attack, capture, death. He had not expected humor. "What happens now?" he asked. Lisa looked back at her troops, then turned to face him again. "Now we talk. You've got a lot of explaining to do, and frankly, so do we." She paused. "But first I have to ask, are there more of you coming?" "I do not know," Hal admitted. The council may decide to listen to my warning, or they may decide to ignore it and proceed with the invasion. He met her eyes directly. But I hope they listen, for their sake, not yours. Lisa's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. That confident in us, huh? I have studied your history, Hal replied. I have seen what you do to enemies who threaten your home. I have seen how you fight when you are unified against a common threat. I would rather make peace with your species than face you in war. He paused. I am hoping that you will give my people the chance to choose wisely. Lisa looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. We'll see, she said. For now, let's get you somewhere more comfortable. We've got a lot to talk about, and I have a feeling this is going to take a while. She turned and began walking toward the military vehicles. After a moment, Hal followed. The soldiers parted to let them pass, watching the alien with wary eyes but holding their fire. As he walked across the Kansas plains, surrounded by armed humans who had every reason to kill him but had chosen not to, Hal understood for the first time what mercy looked like when offered by a species that had absolutely no obligation to give it. He hoped his people would be wise enough to accept it. Because if they were not, if they chose conquest over peace, then everything he had seen and learned told him the same truth. The humans would fight. They would die, but they would not stop. And in the end, it would not be Earth that fell. It would be the Empire. Hal walked toward an uncertain future, surrounded by the most terrifying species he had ever encountered. And for the first time in his long life, he felt something that might have been hope. Not for his own survival, but for the possibility that two very different species might find a way to exist together, in peace, without either one having to destroy the other. It was a fragile hope, a human hope. He was beginning to understand why they valued it so much.